Having looked at how Jackson transformed politics, we're going to look today at some of the issues that defined his time in office. And it's important to go back to our discussion of the rise of the market economy from last week. A lot of the things that we're talking about in that activity are happening as Jackson comes to office. We're seeing the rise of this so called market evolution, where you're seeing regional specialization, you're seeing a transportation infrastructure allowing for a market economy to emerge, and the economy is growing as a result of that. But the question really becomes, is that something that's a source of independence or something more sinister? Is this something that's a source of independence from Great Britain in terms of manufacturing goods, a source of independence for business owners and workers who are, engaged now in a wage earning economy? Or is it a source of dependence on banks and dependence on businesses and dependence on corporations? Are we seeing corporate interests take over and usurp the public interest over the course of this time period? And there was significant debate about that going forward. And so that's going to lead to some controversial issues dealing with the tariff, some controversial issues dealing with the bank. You'll see regionalization take place here as there is north-south conflict over the tariff. There's east-west tension over the bank issue. And so it's going to be a very tumultuous time for Jackson as he define what interests are going to take precedent there. Also, it's important to remember that expansion is continuing out to the west. This is when Texas, and during Jackson's second administration, will become an issue so hot that even Jackson won't touch it. But you're seeing more white expansion into previously, quote unquote, unsettled territories. And that's going to lead to problems for Native Americans. As we go forward, then, I've included a timeline to kind of show you where things are playing out in Jackson's time in office. It's color coded here. Black is political. Red deals with the tariff issue. Purple with Indians. Blue with the bank. And I don't really care that you know the dates of all this stuff. I just want you to see in here that these are going to be intertwined over the course of Jackson's 2 terms in office. And the video clips we're going to see are going to go more issue by issue. All right. So with that said, let's look first at Native Americans and see where we go from there.
Elias Boudinot, the Cherokee Nation. What sort of hope have we from a president who has an inclination to disregard laws and treaties? We have nothing to expect from such a president.
Like Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson fervently believed that it was small, self-employed farmers who had made America great. And he believed that the key to keeping it great was to continue expanding west so that each new generation could have farms of their own.
In Jefferson's vision, the frontier was the place that each generation would replicate the ideal Republican community. The problem, of course, is that the native people are already living out there. And with one eye, Americans managed to not notice them. But with the other eye, they couldn't fail to notice them, because as soon as you got there, you were in conflict with them. And that creates the fundamental tension that becomes the story of Indian removal.
In 1830, Jackson won approval from Congress of an Indian Removal Act that appropriated $500,000 so that Native Americans living east of the Mississippi could be removed to land west of the Mississippi. In support of the act, Jackson said,
"What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion?"
But Native American tribes, such as the Cherokee, had an entirely different view than white men of how to relate to the land.
The Cherokee way is to share, is to be harmonious. They really were a spiritual people. They had a way of life that would perhaps put most Christians to shame. They exercised that way of life daily. Every morning, the whole village would go to the water for a blessing. And at this going to water ritual, this old man sung this song. Hi-o wa yakani, hi-te-hu-yu yakani, hi-wa aki yakani, hi-wa sa-se yakani, hi-ani ze-si yakani, hi-ani he-ho yakani. So when I sang that song, it would have been the same sound that you would have heard in the 1700s. So that was all disturbed because of the contact with the whites.
Soon after the creation of the United States, many in the Cherokee tribe decided that their one hope of saving their land was to take Thomas Jefferson's advice and embrace the white man's way of life.
The Cherokees, in fact, took exactly the advice that Jefferson offered. They settled down, they put on European clothing, they developed an alphabet, they learned to read and write, they set up town meetings and a mayor and city council and all those things. And they still had to go, because the problem was they were sitting in Georgia. And Georgia was to be ours, not theirs. They could not coexist.
With Georgia preparing to expel the Cherokee, 2 Christian missionaries brought a case to the Supreme Court that challenged Georgia's jurisdiction over the Cherokee Nation. The Supreme Court ruled in the Cherokees' favor, but Andrew Jackson declared,
The decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn.
Jackson encouraged Georgia to ignore the verdict on the grounds that the Cherokee were not really a nation. A writer to the Cherokee newspaper The Phoenix, remembering that warriors from the Cherokee Nation had played a key role in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend that had launched Jackson on his road to fame, had this request.
Ask of General Jackson when the thunders of his cannon were heard in the southern forest, and he will say, they are a nation. These unfortunate people who flocked to the standard of the brave commander at Horseshoe and nobly fought are now repaid with ingratitude and oppression.
Solely on the basis of the color of their skin, thousands of Cherokee families were evicted from their homes by American soldiers and forced onto what became known as the Trail of Tears. One of the Christian missionaries who traveled with them wrote,
I have no language to express the emotions which rend our hearts to witness this season of cruel oppression. In Georgia, multitudes were not allowed to take anything with them but the clothes they had on. Well-furnished houses were left a prey to plunderers who, like hungry wolves, follow the progress of the captors and rifle the houses and strip the helpless. For what crime, then, was this whole nation doomed to this almost unheard-of suffering?
The period of Indian removal really is a black mark on American history. America, which started out as a shining city on a hill, sinks to the bottom of the darkest depths in Indian removal. Andrew Jackson and other Americans were willing to do what it took to separate Indians from their land, if it meant ignoring treaties, if it meant ignoring principles of international law, if it meant ignoring common decency, and a sense of justice, then it was done.
With smallpox and cholera rampant on the Trail of Tears, more than 2,000 Cherokees died. Andrew Jackson had tried to convince Native Americans that he was their great white father. But the Cherokee now had a different name for him.
They call him Jacksonian. And other Cherokees people hearing me say that would laugh. Jackson, the devil. Jacksonian. He's devilized.
Andrew Jackson. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you ready to incur its guilt?
If the Eaton affair had an air of melodrama, it was also a sign that tragedy was waiting in the wings. Vice President John C. Calhoun, whose wife had battled Jackson over Peggy Eaton, was simultaneously involved in another crisis, one that threatened to bring the nation to civil war.
John C. Calhoun, from about 1830 on, was obsessed for the remainder of his life with one fundamental problem. And that was the problem of protecting slavery in a nation where slaveholders were becoming a minority. How could slavery be perpetuated in the face of an indifferent or even hostile North?
The crisis was triggered not by slavery, but taxes. Congress, eager to protect northern factories, had passed a law which imposed a high tax on the cheap imported cloth used by southern plantation owners to clothe their slaves. Determined to eliminate the tax and protect slavery, Calhoun began promoting nullification, under which every state had the right to disregard, within its borders, any law it considered unconstitutional.
Nullification appealed to Calhoun and other South Carolinians because it was a way of asserting states' rights. And clearly that was a fundamental threat to the entire idea of a federal system. And it went straight to the heart of the fundamental American question of who was sovereign. Was the federal government sovereign? Was the state, were the states sovereign? Were the people sovereign? These were all incredibly complicated questions that consumed the Jackson White House and Jackson's Washington.
Nullification's fiercest supporters were congressmen from South Carolina. Its bitterest opponents were northern congressmen who were convinced it would lead to the breakup of the Union. And then there were those whose positions were unknown, including President Andrew Jackson. On April 13, 1830, all three factions were represented at a dinner in Washington, D.C., in honor of Thomas Jefferson's birthday. John C. Calhoun and the nullifiers had been plotting for months to use the event to convert those sitting on the fence to their cause. And in their eyes, Jackson, a fellow slave owner, was a natural ally. But Andrew Jackson had his own plans for the dinner. And as he arrived, he felt the same thrill he had always felt before a battle. As the evening began, the nullifiers endeavored to build support by making toast after toast to the importance of states' rights. Then suddenly, President Jackson raised his glass. Looking John C. Calhoun straight in the eye, he made his toast.
Our federal union It must be preserved.
Those 7 words sent shockwaves through Washington, for all now knew where Andrew Jackson stood. He would not tear apart the nation he had helped build. For Vice President Calhoun, Jackson's opposition to nullification was intolerable. The 2 men soon stopped speaking. Then, in November of 1832, the state of South Carolina formally nullified the tax and added that if the federal government challenged its right to do so, South Carolina would withdraw from the Union.
It's hard for us to understand how serious nullification was. It nearly led to civil war. Troops in South Carolina were marching. Jackson himself wanted to lead the federal army into South Carolina. They were fortifying forts in Charleston Harbor. This was very close to an all-out civil war, and it was Andrew Jackson's duty to stop that.
Instead of reacting in anger, as he had so often before, Jackson issued a presidential proclamation in which he appealed to the people of South Carolina.
Seduced as you have been, my fellow countrymen, by ambitious, deluded, and designing men, I call upon you in the language of truth and with the feelings of a father to retrace your steps. Say, we too are citizens of America. Carolina is one of these proud states. Her best blood has cemented this happy union. And then add, if you can, without horror and remorse, this happy union we will dissolve. This picture of peace and prosperity we will deface. These fertile fields we will deluge with blood. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you ready to incur its guilt?
And that's when he said, the union is perpetual. It is not a union of states. It is a union of people. And once you're in that union, you can't get out. And I, as the chief executive, have sworn to enforce the laws. Both those ideas are adopted by Abraham Lincoln in his inaugural. The whole thing is set up by Jackson.
With both sides preparing for civil war, the most skilled negotiator in Congress, Henry Clay, succeeded in winning passage of a compromise bill that dramatically lowered the tariff. Jackson signed it, South Carolina agreed to abide by it, and war was averted. For Andrew Jackson, the story of nullification contained a dire warning. If Americans kept arguing about slavery, a civil war was inevitable. And so the president began appealing to Northerners to stop agitating against slavery. For Andrew Jackson, the central question of his presidency was what he could do to prevent these average Americans from being exploited by the rich and powerful. The answer Jackson hit upon was to destroy an institution that he thought was giving the wealthy an unfair advantage. Its real title was the Second Bank of the United States, but Jackson supporters called it the Monster Bank.
Andrew Jackson dislikes all banks, he said at one point, but he particularly disliked the Bank of the United States as established by Congress after the War of 1812. The reason was simple. It had too much power outside of any kind of public accountability. The bank was an enormous economic institution. It could really control credit and therefore control the American economy itself. For Jackson, that meant that the American economy was being run by people who were not elected, that these unelected bankers had their hands on the levers of power and could control people's lives, their destinies, and indeed could control the political system itself.
To Jackson, one of the monster bank's worst sins was that it was funding new-style businesses that were beginning to wrap their tentacles around both the economy and the government. These new businesses were called corporations.
The problem with corporations, as far as Jackson was concerned, was they had no body to be kicked or soul to be damned. They were faceless, anonymous machines that were motivated only by making profit for their shareholders. And as a result, they could grow much, much larger than the average consumer, the average worker, the average citizen.
But Jackson's opponents thought corporations would help America become more prosperous. And they thought his plan to blow up the bank verged on insanity. For it was the bank that guaranteed that the paper dollars in Americans' wallets were worth something.
Jackson took a kind of fundamentalist view of money and credit. Gold and silver dollars were real money. Paper was in some sense fake. Those who were perhaps more astute economists than Jackson thought that this position was just short of Neanderthal. The United States had been built on credit. As Henry Clay said in the Senate, we have always been a paper money people. We won the revolution on paper money.
Clay and his allies in Congress decided to put some heat on Old Hickory. Near the end of Jackson's first term, they passed a bill extending the bank's charter. Clay calculated that the president would have no choice but to sign the bill, because a veto would be seen by the American public as so irresponsible it would cost Jackson re-election. But Clay had made a fundamental miscalculation about the character of Andrew Jackson. A character that was exemplified by an event that took place in the midst of the battle over the bank. At the president's request, a Navy surgeon was brought to the White House to operate on a painful shoulder. The problem was a simple one. There was a bullet in it. 20 years before, during the War of 1812, Major General Jackson became embroiled in a feud between one of his officers and a prominent Nashville family. Instead of mediating the dispute, as might have been expected of a man of his stature, General Jackson took part in a full-scale gun battle. During it, he was shot at point-blank range and almost died. This saga defined the character of Andrew Jackson. He could not pass up a fight, and when he fought, he was willing to risk everything. Of the bank, he declared,
"The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it."
On July 10, 1832, Jackson vetoed the bill reauthorizing the bank. The president's address in defense of the veto was perhaps the most important of his life, for he had to explain to the American people, not with bombast, but with words from his heart, why he so fervently opposed the bank.
It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. When the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, The humble members of society, the farmers, the mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. We can at least take a stand against any prostitution of our government to the advancement of the few at the expense of the many.
On Election Day, voters flocked to the polls in record numbers. And thanks to Jackson's reputation as a military hero and his continuing expansion of America, they gave Old Hickory a landslide victory. But what Andrew Jackson read into the victory was that he now had a mandate to destroy the Bank of the United States. And so the president ordered the government's money removed from the bank. But even some in his own cabinet thought such a step was illegal, and Jackson had to replace 2 Treasury secretaries before finding a third who would obey him.
Nothing like this would happen again until Richard Nixon, during the Watergate crisis, had to go through 3 attorneys general to find one who would fire Archibald Cox as special prosecutor.
On the floor of the U.S. Senate, Henry Clay asserted that nothing less than the future of American democracy was at stake.
We are in the midst of a revolution, hitherto bloodless, but rapidly tending toward the concentration of all power in the hands of one man.
For the only time in American history, the Senate censured the president. People throughout the nation began calling it the Bank War. It was a war in which reason and economics were the casualties, and the chief combatants were Jackson and the president of the bank, Nicholas Biddle.
The confrontation between Andrew Jackson and the Bank of the United States escalated, you might almost say, beyond the bounds of sanity. From the point of view of Nicholas Biddle, president of the Bank of the United States, this maniac president was going to destroy the American economy. And both sides got so wrapped up in it that they did reckless things. Nicholas Biddle, in an effort to procure a recharter, actually triggered what was called a panic in those days, a stock market crash and a brief depression, not realizing that in doing this he was proving every point Jackson made about the reckless power that the Bank of the United States held over ordinary Americans' lives.
Finally, in 1836, the bank's charter expired and its doors were closed, and Andrew Jackson once again emerged from a battle victorious.
An historian has written that every once in a while in American history, it becomes necessary to save American capitalism from the capitalists, that left to their own devices, they will so accrete power that they will end up ruining the economy. Well, Jackson in some ways saw that was the beginning of that process, as American capitalism was just beginning to develop. He saw that to keep the system going in a democratic fashion, as he saw it, it was necessary that accountability had to be there in the system in a way that it did not seem to be as of 1832.
Jackson's battles during his second term in office were not just political. One afternoon, as the president was leaving the Capitol, a mentally ill man who believed that Jackson had killed his father approached him. The explosion of the pistol's percussion cap convinced bystanders that the president had been shot. But the gunpowder inside the pistol failed to ignite. The assailant then drew a second pistol and fired point blank into the president's chest. Miraculously, the powder inside the second gun also failed to ignite. As a result, Andrew Jackson survived the first assassination attempt ever against an American president.
In the end, Jackson has a huge impact on the presidency. The rise of the spoils system will go a long way towards reinforcing the two-party system, even though we'll see third parties emerge during this time period. But he's the first to embrace the idea that you could use the government as a means of reinforcing your own power by rewarding supporters with government jobs and or government contracts. And that was a major expansion of the power of the presidency, and one that really expanded the political presence of the president going forward. He also expands the political power of the president because he's the first person to veto a bill, not because it was unconstitutional, but because he didn't like it. Recall the case of McCulloch versus Maryland under the Marshall Court had established the constitutionality of the bank, but Jackson didn't like the bank, so he vetoed that. And that was significant in terms of expanding the power of the presidency. It's also the first time that the president really takes on the mantle of the chief of party, that Jackson becomes a major player in Democratic Party politics as a result of that. And that's going to lead to new forms of campaigning, and that you saw over the course of the video, and a real expansion of how the campaigns are going to work, and how the parties are going to take a larger role in promoting elections. Finally, you'll find that it's going to lead to the rise of a second party system in America. Recall, the first party system was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but you've seen this earlier in our class, looking at how the first parties began to emerge. And then after the War of 1812, with the demise of the Federalist Party that you see in the upper left-hand corner, and the rise of nationalism and the era of good feelings that come about after the War of 1812, that's going to lead to the election of 1824, creating problems and factions within the Democratic Republican Party, between Jackson's Democrats and the National Republicans that emerged there. And finally, Jackson's presidency will go a long way towards redefining a new party system. And so by 1834, you see the rise of a new second party, the Democrats led by Jackson, and the Whigs led by Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams, and others. They're very similar in terms of they inherit the mantle of the parties that came before them. The Democrats are much like the Democratic Republicans of old. They favored expansion, individual rights, states' rights, state banks. They oppose internal improvements as being government overreach. Whereas the Whigs are kind of the inheritors of the old Federalist system. They oppose expansion because it would create more westward influence, more Western influence in politics, and more land for farmers and lower class voters. They favored moral reforms. They favored a common moral code. We mentioned that conservatives tend to embrace the whole society as a whole, structure as a whole, and they favor a common moral code as we start seeing some reforms coming down the pike in the 1830s and 1840s. They favor internal improvements to grease the skids of commerce across the country. They want a strong central government. They favor the national bank. And you can see more of those principles there. But the real glue that holds the Whig Party together is hatred of Andrew Jackson. It's really a coalition party of old Federalists and anti-Jackson Democrats like John C. Calhoun, for example, will dabble in Whig politics some, because there are Democrats that oppose the strong power of the presidency that Jackson had promoted. And so it's a tenuous coalition that will last for about 20 years. We'll only have two successes in terms of running for the White House over the course of this time period. But will last beyond Jackson. And I want to make sure we're clear on that Jacksonian democracy does not end with Jackson. You'll see that influence in politics will go well beyond Jackson's tenure and into the next couple of decades, and really kind of define politics. So you see in here the flow chart here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but you'll see in here the rise of the new two-party system. You'll also see third parties emerge here. The anti-Masonic Party is the first real third party in American politics, and they run against Andrew Jackson. And they don't like the Masons because they fear the influence of secret societies. And so they see them as inherently undemocratic, and so they're kind of an anti-Jackson party. Then you see the rise of things like the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party in the 1840s. We'll get more into those a little bit later on when we start talking about the influence of slavery and how it combines with Western expansion. But over the course of this time period, then, you start seeing, again, a redefinition of how politics works. In the 1832 election, for example, you see the first national convention, the Anti-Masonic Party, are the first to host a national convention and put forth the first time they had a party platform where they actually came out and said, here's what we stand for. Jackson's reelected in that election, and then in 1836, the Democrats hold a national convention for the first time. They'll nominate Martin Van Buren. He's Jackson's hand-picked successor. We'll see how his presidency turns out in just a bit. But again, a tumultuous campaign. And then in 1840, you really see kind of, in some ways, the culmination of Jacksonian democracy in that you see the so-called log cabin and hard cider campaign. The Whigs formed this coalition of anti-Jackson Democrats and strong former Federalists to create this kind of pro-business party. They nominate William Henry Harrison, a war hero, and they nominate John Tyler, a Democrat, to be his running mate. So again, kind of this coalition party here. The Democrats will renominate Van Buren, and it ends up being one of the most crazy campaigns in American history. And we'll see how that plays out in just a moment. So again, as we look at how we see the redefinition of parties and campaigning, one of the things that the parties have to do now is they have to reach out to common man voters. They have to reach out to these people who had not voted before. And one of the ways they'll do that is through the use of campaign songs. So take a listen to this ditty from Jackson's 1828 campaign and think about what it says about what makes Jackson qualified to be president.
Ye gentlemen and ladies fair that grace New Orleans city, come listen if you've time to spare while I rehearse a ditty. And for the opportunity, consider yourself lucky. It is not often that you see a hunter from Kentucky. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. Now you all did read in the public prints how Pakenham attempted to make our Hickory Jackson win, but soon his scheme repented. For Jackson he was wide awake, he was not scared of trifles. Full well he knew what aim we take with our Kentucky rifles. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. He led us down to the cypress swamp. The ground was low and mucky. There came John Bull and Marshall Pump, and here stood old Kentucky. Old Hickory led our little band. None wished it to be greater, for every man was half a horse and half an alligator. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. Well, the British found 'twas vain to fight where lead was all their booty, and so they wisely took to flight and left us all this beauty. And so if danger e'er noise, remember what our trade is. Just send for us Kentucky boys, and we'll protect you ladies. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky.
Two things stand out in this song from Andrew Jackson. One, he parlays his fame as a war hero from the War of 1812 into the presidency. He plays off his role in the Battle of New Orleans and capitalizes on that fame as a means of generating popular support for his candidacy. The other, he emphasizes Kentucky. And I think that's really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it does harken back to the Kentucky long rifle, which was a major tool used by the frontiersmen who fought alongside Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. The other thing that's really interesting is that it gives him the opportunity to stick his thumb in the eye of Henry Clay. He wants to win Kentucky in part because it's one of the biggest electoral prizes west of the Appalachian Mountains, but also he knows that winning Kentucky will really stick in Henry Clay's craw, and so he does that very well. Jackson is not the last person to capitalize on his fame as a war hero as a candidate. The best example of a Jacksonian democracy campaign comes in 1840 when the Whigs nominate William Henry Harrison and his running mate John Tyler. They're going to capitalize on Harrison's fame as a war hero, even though he's kind of a dark horse candidate, and unite that ticket with a Democrat from the South in John Tyler in order to win the presidency. The way they do this is by creating a rousing campaign based upon Harrison's fame from the Battle of Tippecanoe in the War of 1812. And the result is one of the most famous campaign slogans and campaign songs in U.S. history.
Oh, who has heard the great commotion, motion, all the country through? It is the ball a-rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler too, for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And with him will beat little Van, Van is a used-up man, and with him will beat little Van. Sure, let him talk about hard cider, and Loch Havens too. Will only help to speed the ball for Tippecanoe and Tyler too, for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And with him will beat little Van, Van is a used-up man, and with him will beat little Van. Like the rush of mighty waters, onward it will go, and its course will bring it through for Tippecanoe and Tyler too, for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And with them will beat little Van, Van is a used-up man, and with them will beat little Van.
Now, looking at this song, it's apparent that the war hero thing is pretty much all that they've got going for them, because if you compare just this song to what you saw from Jackson in 28, there's even less here telling you what makes him qualify to be president. But this song is immensely popular in the tavern scene across the country, and it's really easy to see as you hear the song. It's easy to see people swaying back and forth and sloshing their beer mugs around as they sing along with the song, and it really reached out to the common person. If you really don't want to understand why it's effective as a campaign song, though, all you have to do is compare it to the one that was used by Martin Van Buren in his re-election campaign in 36, and you'll understand why he lost.
Rock-a-bye, baby, daddy's a Whig. When he comes home, hard cider he'll swig. When he has swug, he'll fall in a stew, and down will come Tyler and Tippecanoe. Rock-a-bye, baby, when you awake, you will discover Tip is a fake. For from the battle, war cry and drum, he sits in his cabin a-drinking bad rum. Rock-a-bye, baby, never you cry. You need not fear old Tip and his tie. What they would ruin, Van Buren will fix. Van's a magician, they are but tricks.
Van Buren makes three key mistakes that are prominent in American politics here. One, he runs on his record rather than his vision. Rather than tell you what he's going to do, he runs on what he has done. He talks about being a little magician, which is a nickname given to him for his efforts in trying to build an independent treasury to try and replace the Bank of the U.S. during the Panic of 1837. Jackson's killing of the bank leads to some unstable loans from state banks that leads to an economic panic in 1837, and they try to fix that with a new independent treasury, earning Van Buren the nickname Little Magician. Second mistake, he tries to run on the truth. His whole thing here is that William Henry Harrison is far from the battle and war cry and drum. He's not as involved in the Battle of Tippecanoe as he wants you to believe, and he tries to point out that, he's a fake across the board. The biggest issue, though, he chooses a terrible song. And whereas Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 really rouses up voters, this one does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is puts them to sleep. And so Van Buren becomes one of a few sitting presidents running for re-election to lose over the course, before he goes into his, what would have been his second term. And it's a repudiation of Jackson in particular because Martin Van Buren was his handpicked successor. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, though, for William Henry Harrison. Harrison goes on to become known for two bits of trivia in American history. One, he gives the longest inaugural address in U.S. history. He speaks for almost 2.5 hours on a rainy day during his inaugural in Washington, D.C. He does so without a coat because he wants to prove what a common man he is. And as a result, he contracts pneumonia, which leads to the second bit of trivia. He has the shortest presidency in U.S. history. He dies 31 days later. And there are some who say that he is the first victim of the curse of Tecumseh. The story of the curse of Tecumseh goes like this. Tecumseh, as we learned in our discussion of expansion and diplomacy, was a Native American leader who was instrumental in leading uprisings along the frontier leading into the War of 1812. He is killed at the Battle of Tippecanoe by Harrison's forces. And the story goes that as he lay dying on the battlefield, that he put a curse on William Henry Harrison and his descendants. And as a result of that curse, every president elected in a year ending in 0 would die in office going forward. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but when you consider that that's Harrison, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Harding, Roosevelt, Kennedy, that's a lot. And the story goes that Ronald Reagan broke the curse when he was elected in 1980 and shortly after taking office was shot in the chest and survived the assassination attempt. So he broke the curse, but George W. Bush, elected in 2000, almost choked to death on a pretzel. That's a true story. And who knows what that means for the person elected at the end of this year. So with that in mind, we'll wrap it up for the day. Please go to the Google Classroom and log on to our assignment for today. We thank you for watching.